Welcome to the right side. Thank you for waking up with us. Kevin Miller in the morning, KIDO Talk Radio. Our great friend Chuck Ambrose joining us when he's not writing bestsellers, rivaling his friend John Grisham. He's talking to us about legal affairs. He knows quite a lot as a former U.S. attorney, assistant U.S. attorney, prosecutor, JAG officer with the Air Force Academy graduate, and fiction writer who now lives in Idaho. We're blessed to have him with us. Chuck, good morning.
Good morning, Kevin.
You know, we take a look at this Epstein thing, and it continues to unravel. You've dealt with people at the highest levels of the federal system. Do you buy that people just fell asleep? And look, you're much more credible than I am when it comes to conspiracy theorists, but the idea of at that highest level, I mean, El Chapo was safe. What do you think happened to Epstein?
Well, I don't know. That's the total answer. The other thing that comes to mind is a couple of memes I've seen on Facebook lately saying that suicide watch doesn't mean that you sit there and watch somebody commit suicide. Without eyes on his cell, it's impossible to tell. I will say this to counterbalance some of the conspiracy theory that's coming across even on other conservative talk radio. It is not necessary to break your neck to die hanging yourself. There have been plenty of forensic incidents recorded where someone hell-bent on suicide hanged themselves from a doorknob. You don't even have to have your feet off the floor. As long as you've got a ligature, that is something around your neck, and you can lean forward long enough to cut off the blood supply, which is really a matter of just a couple of minutes, you will lose consciousness and you will die. So is it possible that he seized the opportunity when nobody else was in his cell or watching to hang himself from the top of a bunk bed? Yes. I mean, that's completely forensically plausible. Now, does that even begin to address the negligence in the corrections facility where he was being held after a recorded suicide attempt, to leave him alone and unsupervised? No. And I think that's what Attorney General Barr is trying to get to the bottom of now. I know that the warden's already been reassigned, and I think some other corrective actions have been taken.
Right. The old question, you're either complicit or incompetent. But the idea of, the guy had a cellmate who was a cop facing, the death penalty. Then he moves out. He had issues. He had tried to kill himself earlier. Again, you're an Air Force Academy graduate. You've dealt with, again, competency at the highest levels. It just seems challenging that he would be given anything, considering the importance of his testimony, of his trial, of holding him accountable, that would leave any probability of doubt that he would make it through the night.
I agree. As has been repeatedly said on some of the news networks, there cannot have been a higher profile prisoner in this nation at the time he was incarcerated. And it is coming to light, if it wasn't already out in the press, that, this guy probably had dirt on some of the most high-powered people on the globe. And so he was of potential value that was inestimable in terms of a witness against those people. Now, he may have left recordings on his island. I know the FBI's been raiding it and collecting other evidence. And as long as there are surviving victims to tell their own tales, they can corroborate any images that might be recorded there, and we don't need Jeffrey Epstein. But is the case weaker without him, assuming that he was willing to trade something for his cooperation? Of course it is. His credibility would have been subject to all kind of attacks at trial, given the horrors that he inflicted on people. But, without him, the case is weaker.
You've dealt with convicting mobsters, right?
Oh, yes.
So most of us, again, Chuck, here on KIDO Talk Radio, we get our information from the movies, but That is a legitimate concern. I mean, Whitey Bulger, they got him.
Yeah.
How safe are the prisons?
When you are a child molester, they are not a place to be. It is not a myth that all these large hulking figures who are in there for, killing each other or their rivals look down on child molesters. Their life expectancy in any penal system is a fraction of any other inmates. They are regarded as morally weak, physically weak, a subject of scorn, and even convicted murderers like the former inmate of Mr. Epstein and others are known to prey upon them. So, again, that's just further reason why this guy should have been under close supervision 24/7. And regardless of whether there's an actual conspiracy involved in removing guards, removing cameras, removing his roommate, or if this is just all gross incompetence, it does need to be looked at because it is so absurd.
What happens next with justice?
I don't know. It depends on what facts might be uncovered. Unlike the other side, I don't think Mr. Barr is going to be inventing evidence to pursue, and so it'll just depend on what comes out of the investigation.
What do you make?
I don't want to get into too much speculation there.
Sure, but what do you make of Attorney General Barr so far?
The only demerit I would give the department so far under his watch is this rather tepid explanation for the lack of criminal charges on James Comey following the criminal referral by the Inspector General. It's really disappointing to see the lack of intent explanation being floated by DOJ after Comey himself came forward with that farce about Hillary Clinton. There is no lack of intent. Any first-year prosecutor could find intent in his confessions before his, in his testimony before Congress and in his news interviews. He admitted doing it. He said why he had made these criminal leads. It was, again, his sanctimonious attitude that I know better than either party, and if I find both nominees to be unworthy of the office, then I'll sabotage them both, and maybe someone will ask me to ride in on a white horse or something. I don't know what his ultimate motivation was other than his incredible superiority complex, but the lack of intent is the last thing the department should have been throwing out there as an explanation for no criminal charges right now. There are good reasons for no criminal charges that I can speculate upon. One, for example, is you never screw up an entire conspiracy case by prematurely pursuing only one charge. If, for example, his leaks were part of an ongoing larger conspiracy that Barr and John Durham want to pursue, you don't want to run off half-cocked and indict that, because at some point it can be the subject of a motion to dismiss because of double jeopardy. Let's say you ride in on this leak charge first, and it gets scheduled for trial because of a speedy trial clock or something like that, and let's say you lose that. That can have the effect of sabotaging the entire investigation that I assume they are pursuing with regard to Mr. Comey's co-conspirators like Brennan and Clapper and those in DOJ, Peter Strzok, McCabe, and the rest.
Very
different. So that's one. Go ahead.
I was going to say just a very different world than we have talked about here when Eric Holder was running justice.
Oh, yeah. And in fact, I think Mr. Holder's lucky that he left office when he did, because he won't be named as a co-conspirator, but his successor may be, that being Loretta Lynch. The other thing that comes to mind there is what we call venue. Now, unless you been through this, a lot of people get that confused with jurisdiction. Jurisdiction is the ability of a prosecutor to bring a case at all because of the violation of a statute within his charter. For federal prosecutors, of course, that means that there has to have been a violation of federal law, not state law. Venue has to do instead with where you're going to try this case. How important is venue? The most telling and recent historical example I can think of is the O.J. Simpson case. For those of us who were around and following the news at the time, we can recall that those murders occurred in Santa Monica in a neighborhood called Brentwood, which is rather upscale. Gil Garcetti, the DA of the Los Angeles County at that time, actually lost to that prosecution before it ever saw the light of day in a courtroom. And he did so by transferring venue to downtown L.A. in a district that included, as I recall, Watts. And he did so for purely political reasons. He thought he would look more fair and gain more votes in his reelection campaign. And so rather than prosecute it where he might have had a more favorable jury, he sacrificed that advantage and, in my opinion, lost the case before it began. Now, in federal court, a conspiracy can be tried in any federal district in which an act occurred in furtherance of that conspiracy. So if I'm looking at this tactically, the last place I want to try Hillary Clinton for her security violations is in Washington, D.C., where every Republican is presumed guilty and every Democrat is always innocent. The voter rolls in that town are 92% Democrat, and they take it very seriously. As long as, for example, I could find an overt act having been committed in the District of Arkansas, that's where I would pursue it. Now, I don't know where venue would properly lie aside from D.C. with regard to Comey's leaks. It's possible that you'd have venue in New York if some portion of his leaking acts were committed there to his friend in the press. I'm not familiar enough with the intricacies of the facts to establish that, but that could be another reason why the department is holding off on pursuing the leak case right now, is because they don't think they have a favorable venue where they may find one in some other aspect of conspiracy.
More coming up with our great friend Chuck Ambrose here, Kevin Miller in the Morning. You're listening to KIDO Talk Radio, 107.5 FM, 580 AM. Rolling on the right side, Kevin Miller in the Morning, KIDO Talk Radio. Don't forget the KIDO Talk Radio app. Chuck Ambrose joining us once again. Chuck, we'll get back to justice, law and order, but you've done things that a lot of people have wanted to do. No, I'm not talking about prosecuting people for the feds, but fiction writing. What led to that?
Well, it's my day job, being a federal prosecutor, is one that generated plot lines day after day. The old saying, the truth is stranger than fiction, is very often true. And I would come home day after day and tell my wife, who also worked in law enforcement, what I had seen that day. And day after day, her response would be, you ought to write a book. And as you mentioned, I went to law school with John Grisham, who has had some success in this field. So I finally took the plunge and did so one day. And I ended up self-publishing the first book called Capital Kill, and it started slowly, but by month 5 or 6, it was selling 1,000 copies a month. And so, some modicum of success encouraged me to continue the series, and that's what we've done.
And what did you do? You just went to Amazon? I mean, there are so many people that self-publish, and from what we understand, self-publishing seems to be the way to go these days.
It's a different world thanks to Amazon. Amazon has opened the door to some success for people who either did not want to go the traditional route, which involves sending an agent a query letter with, how would you like to pick this up? Here's a couple of chapters. If you'll give me an advance, I'll finish the book. And then, of course, you're sacrificing 80% of your content control to the agent and editors and the publishing company. And if you're lucky at all, your first book will sell out the first run, which allows you to write a second one. But if you're not lucky and that first run, that publishing run does not sell out, then all of a sudden you're out of print and nobody wants to talk to you anymore. We've gone through this a little bit before, but that average bookstore commission for a traditionally published author may be 15 to 17 cents on a $15 book. The payment scale for self-publishing, because you're taking some of the risk yourself, is much better. And unless you're an A-lister like my friend Grisham or John Connolly or Patterson or some of the other really big names, you're going to make more on the self-publishing scale than you would the traditional route. And a lot of formerly traditionally published authors are now self-publishing because of that.
Now, are you still self-publishing?
Yes.
And you like the Amazon stuff?
Well, Amazon is the big boy on the block. In addition to royalty payments for the ebooks and paperbacks that you actually sell, there is a separate revenue stream that they offer through their subscription program called Kindle Unlimited that pays the author by the page read. Since the subscriber doesn't actually buy the book, but really only, in essence, rents it as part of their subscription fee, they had to figure out some way to pay the writers for participating in that program. And generally these days, if you're having any success at all, about 50% of your royalties are coming from the actual sales, and the other half are coming from pages read in the subscription program. So it gets a little bit technical and down in the weeds, but the bottom line is this. Even the traditionally published authors these days average only about $7,500 a year. And we've been able to do that at least double or triple on the self-publishing route, and I think more and more people are going that way. I actually think the New York agents and publishing houses still have a place because there are a lot of people that want to be able to physically hold a book and browse through it in the bookstores and that sort of thing, but it's a diminishing world, and a lot of their efforts these days are protecting it rather than growing it. I had a conversation with one agent. This is after the Royals won the World Series, and we had just left Kansas City. And I said, if you wanted to do what this small market team just did to win the World Series, you've got a built-in minor league you could scout all through Amazon. You wouldn't have to look at just 2 chapters in a query letter. You could see a finished product. You could see sales. You could read the entire book for free. And you could go out and sign some previously self-published people, and I think you'd do a lot better. And their response was, well, there's just so much crap out there that's self-published. And my retort was, yes, and there's a lot of traditionally published crap too, because I read it. So, again, it's a changing world, and it's been a very interesting ride to be part of it.
Traffic and weather together, KIDO Talk Radio. Good morning, Dave. Thank you, Larry. We continue on with Chuck Ambrose. So, and we've talked a little bit about this before, but there are new people tuning in all the time. Chuck, we've got about 2 minutes in this segment. The idea of coming up with dialogue. I mean, everybody jokes about the voices in their head, but to make it readable, how do you make that happen?
Well, I've told other people that I have found the best way for me is to essentially plug myself into the heads of the characters as I'm writing and just ask myself, what would this guy say next? What would he do next? And rather than try to force one scene into the next, if you put yourself into the scene as if you were watching it on television or movie, it tends to flow a lot better.
Well, there you have it. It's all flowing, but again, some of us get confused when we where do we put our keys? And then you're dealing with all these characters. For people that would love to check out your books, can you tell us the titles and where they can get them?
They're all available on Amazon in both Kindle and paperback form. The first one that we started with was Capital Kill, which actually made it to #1 in Amazon's Kindle Store Mystery Series category for sales rankings. That had to do with the Jamaican drug posse wars. Next had to do with MS-13. That's Horns of the Devil, which is the gang sign that MS-13 members flash. So it's not about satanic cults, other than the devilish thing that those gangsters pulled. The third volume is Death's White Horses, which is a tale of the Mexican cartel wars that are continuing to this day. And unfortunately for that nation, their body count keeps rising. It's the second highest body count in conflict since the American Civil War, at least in this hemisphere. The fourth book, A Winter of Wolves, has to do with a terrorist cell on the East Coast. The fifth book, which I think a lot of people would find interesting, is Death Votes Last. And the hypothesis there is, in an evenly divided U.S. Senate, one side tries to change the numbers not through an election, but by killing one of the other side's senators. And then our last book that we just published this year is called Mob Rules. When I was in Kansas City, I did quite a few mafia cases and incorporated some of those stories into that book. And so it's been out since March, I believe.
And more coming up with our great friend Chuck Ambrose, Kevin Miller in the morning, KIDO Talk Radio. Don't forget the KIDO Talk Radio app. Check it out at the App Store, Google Play. Kevin Miller, KIDO Talk Radio. Good morning, Maggie. And we continue on with Chuck Ambrose joining us here, KIDO Talk Radio, 107.5 FM, 580 AM. We were talking earlier about the book writing and stuff. What about movies? Are you looking into that? Have people approached you on this? I can remember several years ago when you first arrived here in the Treasure Valley, we talked about your classmate, John Grisham, this, that, and the other. But what's the outlook look for you in your series?
Well, I don't know. It's up to somebody in the film industry to want to use one of the books as a basis for one. We do have a publicist who approached me and suggested that we turn the first two books into a script. We've done that, and that's being presented to several of the big publishing houses on the West Coast, and also a lot of the new digital formats. Everybody from Netflix to Amazon to other streaming services is now in the television and or movie business, so the demand for quality content is certainly there, but as with anything else, it just takes being lucky enough to have the right person see it at the right time.
Without getting too much in the weeds, the difference between writing a book and writing a script?
Scripts cannot be as dependent upon dialogue. They're more visual by definition, or at least the final product that the script generates is. So you have to concentrate more on physical action, and keep in mind the time segments. You're usually, for television, you're writing for 5 to 7 minutes between commercials. You have to keep that in mind when you're blocking scenes in your mind so that, there's essentially a teaser from one section to the next. It really is a different technique, and I learned a lot from going through the process the first time. So if I ever have to do it again, the first one pays off, I think I'll be a little more prepared.
Well, and again, most of us take that for granted, but, again, we're talking hours, right? Hours in front of a word processor, right? Months.
Months. And that's with a book already written, doing the transformation. So, yeah, it's a different world, and of course you have to do all the scene setups describing the background, what's going on, what other people may be doing aside from the main character. So anything that might be implied in the written book has to be more fleshed out when you're essentially blocking scenes for film or television.
Chuck, let's go back to you for a moment. This is entertainment for you. Most people, they put in your time. You had a great run with the government. They'd be at the beach hanging out with the dogs.
Well, I do have dogs, but I don't think I want to take these two to the beach. They're not socialized enough for that yet. I have a Siberian Husky and something called a Border Jack, which is a half Jack Russell, half Border Collie. And the little Border Jack would probably hang with us, but if I let that Husky off leash, I might never see her again. They are just bred to run.
Sure. But again, you choosing just to continue to work, I guess my point being.
Well, certainly. I get bored easily after the career I had, and having this as a paying hobby has been a good thing. You know, we're not getting rich off of it by any means, but it's covering some expenses, and I'm having some fun doing it.
When you're not doing that and you're watching the TV, you sometimes yell at it when people compare the Russian collusion delusion to Watergate.
No, I actually think the Russian collusion delusion is much more serious than Watergate. In Watergate, you had a president with some moral failings who was basically covering up the stupidity of some minions. And here we've got the heads of 4 or 5 of the most powerful agencies in the federal government who got together in a politicized clique and tried to stage a coup. So I really think this is a much more trying time for the nation than even Watergate was. And I hope we get to the bottom of it and that people are held equally accountable, if not more so.
Well, I think that's the scary part about it. I think the libs are trying to run out the clock, hoping to get a Lynch or a Holder back into justice and shut the whole thing down if the president doesn't get reelected.
I think you're correct in that, and I'm hoping that we'll see the details of the Barr Durham investigation later this year. And, the big question then is which, if any, of the networks will have the judicial integrity to even cover it. The collusion between the Democratic Party and the so-called mainstream media, I think they've lost so many subscribers now that they really are no longer the mainstream. I think you're part of the new mainstream thing, Hittens, and if that trend continues, we might be all right. But some of the silliness that we see in what used to be journalism is just appalling. I think it boils or goes back to a lot of just pure elitism. That's it's a common excuse that we hear, but Kevin, I've experienced it. I know when I was in D.C., and this was even in a Republican administration, the U.S. attorney that replaced Joe DeGenova, and I won't mention the gentleman's name right now because he's a good guy and he was a good manager, but he actually cornered me in the hallway one day and said, "Where did you go to law school?" And I told him the Air Force sent me to law school. I didn't have a choice where to go, but they sent me to Ole Miss because I was a Mississippi resident at the time. And he said, "Well, you're doing very well in your trials. I'm just surprised that, someone from Ole Miss could do as well." And I looked at him and I said, "Why does that surprise you?" And I told him, I said, law school is really just a glorified trade school. I know we went through for 3 years, but you could practice criminal law with 4 courses: constitutional law, criminal law, evidence, and criminal procedure. The rest of it, torts, contracts, all that sort of thing, doesn't help you a bit in this particular field. And as long as you master those courses and are a decent advocate, you can be an effective prosecutor. But this guy was from Harvard. And it has recently come to light, and I firmly believe it, that people who get into Harvard Law are told that regardless of what you do here, you already have it made. That is the mindset that they have, and they do look down on people from other schools. And the end of our conversation, I thought was quite telling. He said, "Well, where did you go to undergraduate school?" And I said, "The Air Force Cap." He said, "Well, how were they ranked?" And I looked at him because I had the rankings. And I said, the year I graduated, they were ranked number 2 in the country. Number 3 was Harvard. Number 1 was MIT. And that absolutely astounded him because, here he was from this blue blood school, and here I was coming from nowhere as far as he was concerned into a completely merit-based system. And, he was still hiring Ivy League people to go into trial and talk to D.C. juries, and I'd watch them stand up and start quoting Descartes and Voltaire, and they might as well have been speaking French. You have to communicate and know your evidence and sell a case in order to get a guilty verdict wherever you are. And some of these people were more interested in puffing themselves up and padding their resumes. So we see that bias in people like Comey, who was a deep stater and an establishment icon. And it's just really depressing that it's come to this and that the country is so divided along those lines right now.
Well, you go back to Comey here at KIDO Talk Radio, and I mean, it's funny. Here you have a guy, Tall Jim, whatever you want to call him, portraying himself as a victim, so much so that he admitted leaking. Take a look at the FBI. Not everybody gets into the FBI. Not everybody can stay in the FBI. We're talking about the highest standards of law enforcement in this country. That's just not words. That's not a TV show. That's what the FBI represents. And here you have the director acting like a petulant child.
Yeah. The FBI, and again, I love the folks in it. I married one, and I love her to death. And, of course, she was an Air Force OSI agent before the FBI hired her as an analyst. But the boots on the ground folks, whether you're talking about support personnel or field agents, are by and large wonderful people. So I don't want to indict the whole agency with a broad brush, but they started a transformation after 9/11 that I blame George Bush for, George W. Bush. And that transformed the agency basically from a criminal investigative agency, which they had been before the attack, into a domestic version of the CIA. And it was one of those changes that was decreed overnight. So I don't think they were institutionally prepared for it. I don't think the transformation went that well. In the Kansas City district where I worked, I saw 7 or 8 squads with 75 agents or so dedicated to crime and violent crime investigation, all of a sudden cut to 4. And the rest of those people that had been criminal investigators are all of a sudden out chasing ghosts. And, yeah, we have terrorist cells across the country. They need to be pursued. And unfortunately, the good work that a lot of those people has done to keep us safe cannot be publicized for security reasons. But I think we lost a lot of the heart of the agency in that transformation and the shift of that mission. And we have left it to other federal law enforcement agencies and local police departments to pick it up. So there has been this flux all the way up and down the line, and I think that, among other things, allowed some political advancement by some less than honest people where it may not have occurred before then.
And more coming up with our friend Chuck Ambrose. Do want to remind you, the Spirit of Boise Balloon Classic next week. Go to our website for more details. Kevin Miller, KIDO Talk Radio. Waking up on the right side, Kevin Miller in the morning, KIDO Talk Radio, 107.5 FM, 580 AM, and the KIDO Talk Radio app. Chuck Ambrose joining us once again. Back to this whole, what's at stake here. McCabe, Comey, Strzok, Page, the Attorney General Barr looking at this. What happens if it's pushed under the rug? What would have happened if Hillary Clinton had won?
Well, first of all, none of this would have come to light. So I'm certainly glad that she didn't. And again, people have, if they ask me who I voted for, I've always said that usually, with maybe 2 exceptions in my lifetime, when I voted for Ronald Reagan, my choice has been what I believed at the time to be the lesser of two evils. And at the time, I voted for Donald Trump the first time because I will vote for him again. I was saying I'd rather have occasional crudeness instead of continual criminality. And I have been pleasantly surprised by this president's level of activity and success because, as has been pointed out time and time again, he is following through on his campaign promises, unlike many of the other Republicans. So he'll have my vote unless, the unthinkable happens and, somebody actually comes up with real criminal conduct on his part. I don't see that on the horizon. They've certainly struck out time and time again, but the animosity on the left, it starts from the sense, I believe, of entitlement on their part. And that's where Hillary was in shock. She said she thought it was her turn. The deep state had anointed her in advance of the election. And it's very telling that state resents the American people telling them no when they work for the American people. We don't work for them, but that is not the attitude of a Comey or a Clapper or a McCabe or a Brennan, and certainly not of a Holder or, in my opinion, an Obama. So, we are in a continuing constitutional crisis, if you want to use a term the left overuses, and that's trying to keep a constitutional republic in place.
Well, many people seem to take that for granted, but obviously we need to be ever vigilant. And you take a look at election fraud, you take a look at everything else. That's a challenge.
Well, Aristotle, and God, I'm getting into the academia here, but 3,000 years ago, looking at little Greek city-states, the guy absolutely pegged it. He looked at all these different forms of government, and he said, a monarchy can be a good thing if you have a benevolent, all-knowing king. But the problem they have, and I'm, of course, transposing words, is that their offspring don't tend to be quite as smart, and so when they inherit the throne, things go to hell. But in terms of forms of government other than monarchies, republics degenerate into democracies, and democracies degenerate into despotism. People think that democracy is a sacred word, but if all you're talking about is majority rule, if the majority says, we're taking your guns, if the majority says, we want to take your money, without a constitutional republic, you have no defense against that. With a constitutional republic, the majority has a lot of sway by design, but there are safeguards built into the process that a pure democracy does not have. And when you go throughout history and look at republics that declined into democracies, he was right. And this would be, centuries after his death. They inevitably, once they became pure democracies, declined into despotism because the demagogues, and that word has the same root as democracy in Greek, promised the people free everything. And at some point, the society cannot afford free everything, and they have to turn back to some other kind of revolution, and generally it's a tyrant at first to stabilize the country before it can reform itself, hopefully again, into a republic.
More coming up with Chuck Ambrose next. First, traffic and weather together. KIDO Talk Radio. Good morning, Dave. KIDO Talk Radio. Thank you, Larry. Appreciate it. Kevin Miller in the morning. Chuck Ambrose with us. Chuck, we've got about 3 minutes left. Why do you love Idaho?
Oh, what's not to love? I mean, other than the fact that it's in the Ninth Circuit, which is a fact that I'm painfully aware of, having done federal prosecutions for years and years. And just as a side note, if a defense counsel ever went into our courtroom and started citing Ninth Circuit case law, the judges would just roll their eyes and dismiss that out of hand. Beautiful state. Great people, the neighborhood we live in, all the children are even well behaved. I mean, we couldn't be happier. Kevin. We were happy in Kansas City, but with some of the people that I had put in jail for 20 and 30 years, the idea of having to look over my shoulder the rest of my life was not very attractive. We went online, started doing our research, and, Meridian, Idaho came up as the number one small city in America. And when we came out and checked it out, I bought a house before I left.
Well, you beat the rush, I think.
I think we did. May have even made some money on the house.
Exactly. Finally, what do you say to career law enforcement people always under siege, it seems? We don't appreciate them enough.
They're more under siege now than they ever have been before. We have what they call a thin blue line flag that we fly far too often in memory of officers recently killed, and it's a very sad thing. I mean, these people put their families and lives on the line every day for the rest of us, and the baseless attacks that we see on them from Ferguson, Missouri to any other place in the country, that's the most disturbing thing. That and the fact of the disrepair that some of these stooges have brought to our law enforcement agencies. They're lucky I'm not their sentencing judge when that time comes.
Well, we sure appreciate you, Chuck. Thank you very much for joining us, and you have a great day, sir.
Thanks for all you do, Kevin. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Take care, Chuck. Thank you. Bye-bye. There you have it, our great friend Chuck Ambrose joining us. Kevin Miller in the morning here. We always appreciate his service and, of course, the service of the entire law enforcement community. Wishing you and yours a great day. God bless. Keep the faith. You're listening to Your Home for Fox News, KIDO Talk Radio.